See, but this was all working down in his basement, and it was mysterious. But he really laid a biggie on us. A real biggie. And to me, it was a historical moment. He had been working for about 5-6 months, maybe 3-5-6 months on this piece of gear, which whenever we came over, by the way, was always at the far end of his workbench, covered up with a piece of cloth. Never mentioned it. And when you'd ask him about it, he'd say, yeah, I'm just messing around. Very enigmatic guy. Just messing around. Until one Saturday night. Very interesting evening. And it changed a lot of us that night. He called up Schwartz and said, asked Schwartz if Schwartz wanted to come over that night. Schwartz said, what for? Because this is very unlike this guy. He was never the kind of guy that asked you to come over. You just went over there, and if he was there, you hung around with him for a while. There's always one guy like that, and he just never cared whether you came or went. That was all. And if you hung around for a while, then finally you just drift out, and that's it. But he never came to your place. He never called you. No way. Well, Anderson called Schwartz. And 5 minutes later, Schwartz calls me. He says, hey, you won't guess what happened. I said, what, Schwartz? He says, Anderson called up. And I says, yeah, so? He says, but he called up and asked me if I wanted to come over tonight. Well, of course, immediately I says, geez, what's up? Maybe the guy's sick or something, I said, what do you mean, Schwartz? You mean he asked me to come over? He says, yeah, come over. He says, he wants me to come over. And he said that if I wanted to call you to ask you over. See, so I said, come over. What's up? Is he going to have a party or something? Because it was so formal, see? Because we just weren't like that. And he says, come on over tonight. Wants to come over, he says, about 8:30. About 8:30. It's really that formal. Come over about 8:30. So I said, sure, a very mysterious thing. So Schwartz and I brought along Flick, who was my close buddy at the time. Schwartz and I and Flick went over to Anderson's house. Now, Anderson lived so completely in the basement that you didn't go upstairs in the house, knock on the door or ring the doorbell and say, it's Johnny. And no, you just automatically went into the basement door. See, that's where he lived. So we go up to the basement door. It's about 8:15, something like that. And Schwartz just, bangs on the door. Hey, Johnny! We didn't go through the doorbell ringing. And you hear a muffled, come on, down there. So we open the door, go down the basement immediately. And there is Johnny down there with all his equipment. He's down by his workbench. He's got all his stuff. He says, now look, he says, you guys. He says, now, I don't want you to touch nothing. Don't touch anything. He said, just do me a favor, don't touch anything. Now, remember, all of us were into electronics. There was not a single layman in the crowd, and in fact, each one of us was a licensed ham. And we still, I still am. So we were all pretty hip to electronic stuff. But here we are. He says, don't touch anything. So with that, it's about 20 after 8, and he keeps looking at his watch. See? He says, well, it's about just about time. And Schwartz says, what are you going to do? What do you mean just about time? He says, well, just wait. I want to show you something. He takes off the cloth now from the top of this thing, and it was a great big chassis. Now, listen to this, George. It's a tremendous chassis he's got, and it's a big one. A chassis is the metal base upon which things are built, and it's a heavy cadmium-plated chassis about 3 inches high. It was at least 25 inches deep, went back, and it was about, I'd say, 28 inches across. Tremendous chassis. And it's just literally covered with enormous power supply in the back, a great big power transformer. He's got high voltage condensers. He's got about 37 tubes with tube shields on them and all this. And he's got a couple of brackets built up. It's really a wild-looking piece of gear. But in the middle of it all, in the middle of all this stuff, he has two metal pieces of aluminum that were built like an angle that came up, and right in the middle of where these, like a triangle, it stood up like a triangle. Right in the middle of that triangle, what would be the top of the triangle, was a tube socket, and the tube socket had been brazed onto this thing, and a lot of wires, cables going down into the chassis, and in the tube socket was a tube, a tiny cathode ray tube. Now, a cathode ray tube was a very expensive piece of gear. And this was a 1-inch cathode ray tube, a 1-inch tube. And it was extending outward. And Johnny turns this equipment on. He says, okay, so I'm going to let it warm up. Don't touch anything. Had about 45 controls sticking out of the front with knobs on it. And the thing hums, and it starts to light up, and you could just feel the heat coming off. This thing was dissipating plenty of heat. And at that, the cathode ray tube started to warm up, and it's green. You see, it's a green cathode ray tube, and there's a green signal on it, just green. And as it began to warm up, a small, dark square appeared in the center of it. Not more than, I would say, probably an inch by 3/4 of an inch. It was a rectangle, a little dark rectangle began to appear, and this thing is warming up, and I could not believe what I was seeing. It was unbelievable. In this little dark square, there were some letters that came on that cathode ray tube and said WBKB. It's fantastic. And we're all standing there looking at this thing, astounded, when all of a sudden, without any warning, that little black thing, with Johnny's not touching it, it disappears, and on comes a tiny face. It's a face. It's green, but it's absolutely crystal clear, and it's looking right out at us. And the face said, "Good evening, experimenters. It is time for a 1-hour experimental broadcast of WBKB television to experimenters who are able to receive this signal. We will now begin a series of transmission experiments involving vertical and horizontal lines and color shadings. We will also transmit a short film. We would request any of you who are watching this and who have any transmission suggestions or reports to give us a call at this number, and we will collate the results of tonight's transmission experiment." And on came a phone number. Johnny Anderson had built the first television set I ever saw in my life. Fantastic. And he was picking up the experimental transmissions of WBKB in Chicago, which was the Balaban and Katz station. BKB, Balaban and Katz. Balaban and Katz Brothers is what it stood for. And on came a film. I couldn't believe it. And the three of us, me and Flick and Schwartz, we stood there with our mouths hanging open. And Johnny is very cool. He's working away there. He's operating this equipment, he's tooling around with the various controls, and he's varying the intensity and so on. He's absolutely cool. And I said to him, I had to say it, I says, "What is it?" He said, "It's television." I said, "How long have you been doing this?" So I've been monitoring these signals now for about a month, maybe 6 weeks. They come on every Saturday night. I said, "You mean this is coming? They're doing that now? It's right now?" He said, "Yeah. In fact, I'm going to call him." He says, "I report every Saturday night. I call in. I tell him how I'm receiving the signal." Great Scott! At that point, I realized there's a world out there that hardly any of us can understand, but a few guys are already fooling around with it. How's that for a historical moment?